The reader turned green. Officer Grant Hayes should have checked the name tied to the card. If he did that, the whole thing stayed in the hallway. If he skipped it, the next steps got expensive fast. A detention. A holding cell downstairs. A public event starting without the person it was built for. Reports that would have to explain why a valid card opened the mayor's office before anyone bothered to verify who was using it. January 4th was cold in Oak Haven. Frost sat on the limestone outside City Hall. The front steps were still clear. The news vans were not there yet. The band was not there yet. A few service trucks were parked along the curb. 2 men from setup were rolling metal barricades toward the front plaza. Ava Sterling came in at 6:15. She came in before the building filled up. Dark wool coat, navy dress, low heels on marble, a slim leather folder under one arm. In her coat pocket was the master access card Ethan Walker had handed her the night before, after the last transition meeting ended. The main security desk on the first floor was empty. Night detail had already cleared out. Event security had not fully settled in. A woman from facilities pushed a cart of printed programs across the lobby. Somebody farther back was stacking bottled water near the rotunda doors. Ava crossed the floor. She took the west elevator up. The second-floor corridor smelled like floor polish and old heat. Grant Hayes was on that floor because he had been moved there. It was early building detail. He had 20 years on the department. He moved through that hall without slowing. He was broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, and smelled like stale coffee. He heard the card reader before he saw her. A soft chirp. He turned the corner and saw a black woman at the executive office door with a card held to the panel. The light had already gone green. The lock had already clicked. Ava had one hand on the knob when Hayes called out, "Step away from that door." She turned. She did not move fast. She did not start talking over him. She kept her hand near the door and looked straight at him. "Good morning, officer." Hayes kept coming. "This floor is restricted." The card opened it. Ava said. He looked once at the panel. The green light was gone by then. The door was still cracked. "Where did you get that card?" "It was issued to me." "By who?" "You can check it." Hayes stopped a few feet from her. His hand stayed low near his belt. He looked at the card, then at her coat, then at the door again. "Let me save you some time," he said. "That card didn't come from this office." Ava kept her voice even. "You can verify it with building management." He did not ask her name. He did not ask what office she was headed to. He did not radio downstairs. He did not call the city manager. He looked at the card again and said, "What? You picked that up from janitorial?" Ava said nothing for a second. Then she said, "No." The corridor stayed quiet. An elevator opened somewhere behind Hayes. Then it closed again. He held out his hand. "Give me the card." "No." He took one more step toward her. "You want to do this the easy way. You show me ID right now. If you think there's a problem, call your supervisor." Hayes gave a short laugh. "I am the supervisor on this floor." Ava looked at him for a moment. Then at the empty stretch of hallway behind him. Then back at his face. "You should verify before you go further." Tyler Reed came around the corner. Young officer. Clean uniform. He slowed before speaking. He looked first at Hayes, then at Ava, then at the office door standing partly open. His eyes stopped on the access panel. "The card work?" Tyler asked. Hayes answered before Ava could. "We've got a trespasser in restricted space." Tyler looked at the panel again. Ava turned toward him. "You may want that checked before he puts this in a report." Tyler did not answer right away. Hayes kept his eyes on Ava. "I'd," he said again. Ava did not reach into her coat. The card stayed in her hand. The office door remained open a few inches behind her. The reader panel was still mounted on the wall to Tyler's left. Green light Already gone. No call made. No name checked. No supervisor asked for. Tyler stayed where he was. Hayes stayed in front of her. Ava stayed at the door. Tyler did not move. Grant Hayes did. He reached for the card first. Ava pulled her hand back a few inches and kept it close to her coat. "You are not taking that from me without a reason," she said. Hayes looked at Tyler. "Turn around," he said to Ava. "Hands behind your back." Tyler shifted his weight. "Grant, maybe we run the card first." Hayes did not look at him. "I gave her a lawful order." Ava kept her eyes on Tyler. "The panel accepted the card," she said. "That can be checked in less than a minute." Hayes took one more step in. "You're refusing ID. I am refusing to hand over building access without verification. That is not how this works." He reached for her left wrist. Ava did not pull away. She did not raise her voice. She set the leather folder on the floor by the wall and said one thing before he turned her. "You should remember this part." Tyler stood there long enough to hear it. The card was still in her hand when Hayes brought both wrists behind her back and closed the cuffs. Metal clicked once. Then again. Tyler looked at the open office door. He looked at the folder on the floor. He looked at the reader panel. Too tight. Ava said. Hayes ignored that. He took the card from her hand after the cuffs were on. Then he nodded toward the far end of the corridor. "Move." He did not take her toward the front elevators. He took her the other way. Past a supply alcove. Past a service cart. And through a gray stairwell door with a push bar. Tyler picked up the folder from the floor and followed. The stairwell was concrete. Painted over too many times. The sound of shoes on metal steps carried ahead of them. Hayes kept one hand near Ava's elbow and the other on the rail. He still had not asked her name. On the landing between floors, Tyler spoke again. "We need to call this in clean." Hayes kept walking. "I am calling it in clean." At the basement door, he keyed them through with his own access fob. The holding area sat behind the municipal loading corridor. Small desk. Old monitor. Property bins stacked on a shelf. A coffee maker on a side table with a burnt smell around it. The duty sergeant looked up once. Then reached for the intake sheet. "What do you have?" Hayes answered before Ava could. "Trespass from restricted executive space. Refused to identify." The sergeant took the card from Hayes and turned it over in his hand. "This from her." "Yes." "Run it." "Not yet." The sergeant looked at Ava's coat. Then at Tyler. Then back at Hayes. Tyler said nothing. The sergeant pushed the blank form across the counter. "Fill it out." Hayes uncuffed one wrist long enough to move her to the property line. Then locked it again. Tyler set the leather folder on the desk. Hayes emptied her coat pockets. Phone. Card holder. Keys. Folded speech pages clipped together at the corner. The master access card went into a clear tray with a printed tag. Ava watched the tray slide across the desk. "That card opens the office because it was issued to do that," she said. Hayes kept writing. "Name." She looked at him. "You did not need my name to put me in cuffs." He stopped writing for a second. Then he wrote anyway. The duty sergeant took the paper, glanced at the first lines, and opened the short gate toward the cells. "Cell 3 is open." Tyler stepped closer. "We still haven't checked the card." Hayes handed him the keys to the cuffs. "Then stand there and learn how a detention works." Tyler unlocked the cuffs at the cell door. Ava rubbed one wrist once, then lowered both hands. No speech. No scene. She stepped inside. The bench along the wall was metal and cold. She sat at one end and kept her back straight. Tyler closed the door because Hayes was watching. The latch caught. Hayes went back to the desk and started typing on the old keyboard with 2 hard fingers. Every few seconds he stopped, looked at his notes, and typed again. Ava spoke through the bars. "I want a phone call. You'll get one when processing is done." Hayes said. There should not be processing. Hayes kept typing. Tyler stood by the water cooler with the property tray still in view. The MasterCard sat on top. The printed tag beside it was blank except for the time. Upstairs. The ceremony staff were starting to arrive. Downstairs. The card had still not been checked. The intake line still read trespass from restricted executive space. Hayes had his version on paper. The tray had the card. The panel upstairs had the entry record. Tyler had seen the green light with his own eyes. That was what the basement held now. Hayes kept typing. Tyler stayed near the water cooler. Ava stayed on the bench in cell 3. The property tray sat on the counter between them. Phone. Keys. Card holder. Speech pages. Master access card in the clear slot on top. The duty sergeant took one call from upstairs and ended it fast. Still no sign of her. He said to nobody in particular. He set the phone down and went back to his magazine. Hayes did not look up. At 8:12, the door from the loading corridor opened and Captain Daniel Mercer walked in. Dress uniform. Overcoat still on. Older. Under one arm. He was supposed to be upstairs within the hour. He stopped at the desk, set the folder down, and looked over the overnight sheet. Anything I need before I go up? He asked. The sergeant pointed with 2 fingers. 1 detention from the executive floor. Mercer glanced at the paper on the desk. Then he looked toward the cells. Ava was still seated on the bench. Dark coat open now. Navy dress visible. Hands resting in her lap. She looked up when he stepped closer. Mercer stopped at the bars. He knew her face from the transition packet. He knew it from the stage program. He knew it from the framed photo outside the city manager's office. He looked once at her, then back at the property tray, then at the intake line Hayes had started, then at Hayes. What is this? Mercer said. Hayes pushed back from the keyboard. Trespass from restricted executive space. Refused to identify. Mercer pointed at the tray. Whose card is that? Recovered from subject. Run it. Not yet. Mercer turned to Tyler. You saw the stop. Tyler answered carefully. I came in after first contact. Sir, did the panel accept the card? Tyler looked at Hayes first. Then he looked at Mercer. Yes. Sir. Mercer held out his hand. Give me the card. The sergeant passed it over from the tray. Mercer flipped it once and looked at the print line under the seal. Then he looked at the back. Special access. Executive level. Temporary full entry. Issued through transition control. Mercer did not say anything for a few seconds. He looked at Ava again through the bars. Ma'am, he said. Were you on your way to the mayor's office? Yes. Who issued the card? Ethan Walker. Mercer nodded once. He turned and walked to the desk phone. Get me Walker, he said to the sergeant. Now. Hayes stood up. Captain. She still refused to identify. Mercer did not look at him. Her card identified her access. Hayes took 1 step forward. She was in restricted space. She was at the office door with a card that opened it. Hayes said nothing. Mercer picked up the second line and waited. Then he said, Walker, this is Mercer downstairs. Did you issue a full access card to Ava Sterling last night? Mercer kept the receiver to his ear. His eyes stayed on the print line at the back of the card. Then he said, Stay where you are. Do not call anybody else yet. Come down here. He hung up and faced Hayes. Open the cell. Hayes did not move. Captain. I was handling a detention. Mercer's voice stayed flat. Open the cell. Tyler was already reaching for the ring on the desk. He got to the lock first. The door opened. Ava stood up and stepped out. She rubbed one wrist once. Then she lowered her hand. Mercer stepped back to give her room. Ma'am, I need to ask one question before we move, he said. Ava waited. Did he ask your name before he cuffed you? No. Did he call building management? No. Did he run the card? No. Mercer turned to Tyler. Did you tell him to check the card? Tyler answered without looking at Hayes. Yes. Sir. Mercer looked at Hayes. Hayes opened his mouth. Mercer cut him off. Stop talking. The duty sergeant folded his magazine shut and set it aside. Nobody touched the keyboard. Nobody touched the tray. Mercer handed Ava the card himself. Then her phone. Then the folded speech pages. He left the cuffs on the counter where Tyler had set them after unlocking the cell. Ethan Walker came through the loading corridor less than 2 minutes later. No coat buttoned. Badge lanyard in one hand. He stopped when he saw Ava standing outside the cell. I gave her that card, he said. Mercer pointed to the intake sheet. Put your eyes on that. Walker read the first line. Then he looked at Hayes. Why is she in a holding cell? Hayes had no answer ready. Walker turned to Mercer. She needs to be upstairs now. Stage call is in less than 30 minutes. Mercer nodded. Then he looked at the sergeant. Pull the intake sheet. Void the entry. Lock the draft report. Nobody touches the bodycam upload from second floor. Nobody edits a word. The sergeant moved at once. Mercer looked at Tyler. You come with me. Then at Hayes. You stay here until I tell you otherwise. Ava took the speech pages from the counter and squared the edges against her palm. Mercer held the door for her. Walker stepped aside. Tyler followed half a step behind. Hayes stayed by the desk. The unfinished report was still open on the monitor. The blank property tags were still stacked by the tray. The cuffs were still on the counter. Mercer did not take Ava back through the loading corridor. He took her to the service elevator at the end of the basement hall. Walker walked beside them with his badge still in his hand. Tyler stayed a step behind. Ava carried the folded speech pages and her phone. The MasterCard was back in her coat pocket. Mercer pressed the call button and looked at his watch. 8:29. No stops on the way up, he said. Walker nodded. The elevator opened. They got in. Mercer keyed the panel for the private floor above the rotunda. Nobody talked during the ride. Ava looked once at her wrists. The marks from the cuffs were still there. She pulled her coat sleeve down over one wrist, then stopped and let it fall back. When the doors opened, they stepped into the short service hall behind the stage area. Up front, the ceremony had already started moving into place. Rows of chairs were filled. News crews stood behind their tripods. A pair of city workers were still straightening the last rope line near the side aisle. On the stage, the podium seal had been centered. The Bible was already on the side table. Chief Justice William Harper stood near the curtain, speaking to an aide and checking his watch between sentences. Blake Turner was near the back wall with a phone pressed to his ear. He ended one call, started another, then stopped when he saw Mercer come through the service hall with Ava beside him. He crossed the room fast. There you are, Blake said. I called your phone 6 times. Ava held up the phone in her hand. It was downstairs. Blake looked at Mercer, then at Walker, then at Ava's wrists. He did not say anything for a moment. He just looked at the marks and then at the speech pages in her hand. Mercer answered the question Blake had not asked yet. There was a detention in the basement, he said. It has been voided. The entry has been pulled. The card was valid. Blake looked at Ava again. Do you need a doctor? No. You need a different coat? No. You need more time? No. Walker stepped in. Stage call is under 30 minutes, he said. The schedule can still hold if we move now. At the far side of the room, Victor Caldwell sat in a front row chair with one ankle over the opposite knee. He had already taken off his overcoat. 2 developers sat near him. A local station reporter leaned in from the aisle to ask something. Caldwell answered without standing. Then he saw the service hall door open wider and turned in his seat. His eyes went first to Mercer, then to Ava, then to her wrists. He stood up. Blake moved closer to Ava and lowered his voice. "We can go straight to the oath and keep the rest tight," he said. Ava looked at the folded speech pages. Then she looked past Blake toward the stage. "No," she said. "We go as planned." Mercer checked the side aisle and spoke to the stage manager. "Use the executive lift," he said. "Bring her in from the center doors." The stage manager nodded and stepped off. That changed the entry. Instead of walking in from behind the curtain, Ava would come in through the brass doors at the back of the rotunda and take the main aisle like the office already belonged to her. Walker looked at Mercer when he heard that. Mercer said, "That is the cleanest route." Nobody argued. An aide came over with powder and a small makeup kit. Ava shook her head once, and the aide stepped back. Another aide offered a fresh copy of the prepared remarks. Ava kept the pages she already had. Blake looked down at the top sheet. The corner was bent from the property tray downstairs. He straightened it with his thumb and handed it back. In the rotunda, more seats filled. A camera operator adjusted one tripod leg and tightened the lock. Two late guests came through the back doors and stopped when they saw movement behind the stage glass. Victor Caldwell remained standing near the front row. He had one hand on the back of his chair now. He said something to the reporter beside him. But she was no longer looking at him. She was looking toward the service hall. Chief Justice Harper came over from the podium. "We are inside the window," he said. "Can you take your place?" Ava nodded. Mercer stepped aside to clear the path. Blake moved with her to the executive lift doors. Walker stayed back with Mercer and Tyler. Before the doors closed, Mercer said one thing. "The upload is locked. The report draft is locked. Nothing moves downstairs until after the oath." Ava looked at him. "Good." The lift carried her up one level and opened behind the brass doors at the back of the rotunda. A stagehand pulled one door, then the other. People in the chairs turned. Reporters near the center aisle lifted their cameras. Blake stepped out first and moved aside. Ava came through the doorway with the speech pages in one hand. Her coat was still on. The left sleeve had ridden back just enough to show the marks on her wrist. She did not cover them. She walked the aisle at a steady pace. No wave. No extra stop. Just straight ahead toward the stage. By the time she reached the front row, Victor Caldwell had stepped away from his chair. He gave her room without speaking. Ava went up the steps. Chief Justice Harper moved toward the podium. Blake took his place near the side table. The city seal sat at the front of the lectern. Ava stopped behind it and set the folded pages down. Then she placed both hands on the wood where everybody in the room could see them. Chief Justice Harper stepped to the microphone and opened the program folder. Blake lifted the Bible from the side table and held it out. Ava placed her left hand on it. Her right hand rose. The marks around her wrist showed under the stage lights. The front rows could see them first. Then the camera operators near the center aisle caught them and pushed in tighter. Harper began the oath. Ava repeated each line in a steady voice. No hurry. No change in pace. Her hand stayed up until the last word. Then she lowered it and took the short handshake Harper offered. Applause came up across the room. It did not last long. Too many people were still looking at her wrists. Blake moved the Bible back to the table. He gave her the folded speech pages. Ava set them on the lectern and placed one hand over them. Victor Caldwell remained off to the side of his chair in the front row. He was not speaking now. The reporter near him had her phone up and pointed toward the stage. 2 more cameras had shifted off the oath setup and onto Ava's hands. Harper stepped back. The microphone was hers. Ava looked down at the prepared pages. Then she looked up at the room. "Good morning," she said. Nobody answered. She touched the corner of the top page, lifted the whole set once, then laid it flat again. "I came in early today to get into this office before the building filled up." She looked toward the center aisle cameras, then back across the front rows. I had a valid access card. It opened the executive office door. She held up her left wrist. Not high, just enough for the room to see the marks again. Before anyone checked the card, I was detained downstairs in this building. A few heads turned at once. A station producer near the back said something into a headset and pointed toward the stage. Caldwell sat down slowly this time. He kept one hand on his knee and watched without writing anything down. Ava set her wrist back on the lectern. The card was issued through transition control. The entry worked. The record is there. The card was taken anyway. I was placed in a holding cell anyway. The draft intake line was started anyway. No long setup. No extra phrasing. Just one line after another. At the right side of the room, Mercer had come in through the side aisle and stopped near the curtain line. Tyler stood behind him. Walker remained farther back with two city staffers. Blake did not move. Ava unfolded the speech pages once more. She looked at the first line. Then she set the pages aside. I had remarks prepared for this morning, she said. Those remarks were written before 6:15. She placed her palm on the wood again. This version is for the record. Several people in the front row straightened in their seats. Ava kept going. The first issue is not a speech issue. It is a process issue. A valid access credential was not checked before force was used. A supervisor was not called. Building management was not called. The card was not run before detention. Those steps are basic. They were available. They were skipped. The room stayed quiet. One of the developers near Caldwell lowered his eyes to his program. Sarah Collins from Channel 7 stepped out from the press row and got closer to the center aisle with her phone held chest high. Ava turned one page over on the lectern. Though she was no longer reading from it, my office will preserve the hallway footage, the body camera upload, the property log, the intake draft, and the access record from this morning. Nothing from that chain is to be altered. Mercer gave a short nod from the side. That line had changed the room. It was no longer just a ceremony. Now it was an instruction on live microphones. Ava reached to the side of the lectern where Blake had placed a black folder. He opened it for her. Inside were the first orders prepared for signature after the oath. She took the top one and read only the title line. Effective immediately. An outside review board will be established with direct access to incident records tied to officer conduct inside municipal buildings. She signed at the bottom. Then she moved the sheet aside. The next page came up. Effective immediately. The office of the mayor will require written verification steps for any detention tied to access control inside city property. Valid credential first. Name check second. Supervisor notice third. No one skips that order. She signed that one too. Pens clicked all through the press area. Phones stayed up. No music played now. No aide crossed the stage. Ava capped the pen and set it down. This morning gave this administration its first work item, she said. It came earlier than expected. She looked once toward Mercer. Captain Mercer is directed to secure every related file before noon. Mercer answered from the side of the room. Yes, ma'am. Ava looked back to the crowd. The city will continue with the schedule for today. The office will continue with the record from this morning. Both will happen. That was the end of the change. She lifted the prepared pages once, squared them against the lectern, and went back to the printed remarks for the rest of the address. The room stayed with her now. Not because of the campaign language in the pages, because the work had already started before the speech was done. The ceremony ended on schedule. The room did not go back to normal after that. Blake moved with Ava through the side hall and into the executive office suite. Walker came in behind them with two binders, a building access printout, and a legal pad already filled with times. The coat stayed on the chair by the door. The speech pages went on the desk. The marks on Ava's wrist were still visible when she reached for the first binder. Blake set a phone near her right hand. "It's every network now," he said. Ava opened the first binder. "Keep the calls stacked. No statements beyond the record already given." Walker laid out the access log. 6:15. Executive card. Accepted. West wing door. Full entry. Then he laid out the property receipt from downstairs. Same card. Same morning. Tagged as recovered item. Then he laid out the intake draft Hayes had started. Trespass from restricted executive space. Refused to identify. Ava looked at the 3 documents in that order. Access log. Property tag. Draft intake line. Blake watched her read. "That is clean enough for any review," he said. "It is clean enough to start with," Ava said. Downstairs. Hayes was no longer at the basement desk. Mercer had him moved to a small interview room off the booking corridor. No one put him in cuffs. No one needed to. His duty belt sat on the table in front of him. Radio off. Building access card beside it. Body camera docked outside. The draft report remained locked in the system under Mercer's order. Tyler stayed in the hall for part of the morning and then was called in to give a short statement. "What did you see first?" Mercer asked. The panel had accepted the card. "Sir, what did you say?" "I told him maybe we should run the card first." "Did he?" "No." "Sir." Mercer wrote that down and asked for the time. Tyler gave the closest minute he could. The duty sergeant gave his piece next. He confirmed the card had not been checked before the intake line started. He confirmed the property tray. He confirmed the void order after Walker arrived. By 11. Internal review had already asked for Hayes's jacket. Not the one on the chair. The full file. Years of complaints. Write-ups. Closed matters. And short findings that had stayed buried in administrative language. Most of them were thin by themselves. A stop here. A hold there. A report line that did not match the first call. A detention that ran longer than the reason on paper. Nothing dramatic on the front page. Enough repetition to matter once somebody finally laid the pages side by side. Bill Dorsey from the union came in before noon. He did not go upstairs. He went straight to the room where Hayes was waiting. Hayes stood when the door opened. "About time," he said. "They're trying to hang this on me over a building stop." Dorsey set a manila folder on the table. It was not thick because of this morning alone. "I read the access log," Dorsey said. Hayes said nothing. "I read the intake draft." Still nothing. Dorsey opened the folder and turned it so Hayes could see the tabs. Prior complaints. Use of restraints. Failure to verify. Detention without underlying charge. Hayes looked at the tabs and then at Dorsey. "This is politics." Dorsey kept his hands flat on the file. "This morning is on camera." The card opened the door. The card sat in the property tray. The report started anyway. Hayes shifted once in the chair. She would not ID. The card was the first check. Hayes looked away. Dorsey closed the folder again. "The union is reviewing representation." Hayes stared at him. "You're pulling support." "I said review. That means you already decided." Dorsey did not answer that. He picked up the folder, left the room, and handed it to internal review before he walked out of the building. Upstairs. The office had turned into a work table. Mercer arrived with a sealed drive, a printed chain of custody sheet, and the hallway stills from the West Wing camera. One frame showed Ava at the door. One showed the reader panel lit green. One showed Hayes entering the frame before any call was made. Ava looked at the stills and pushed them back across the desk. "What is his status on the active board?" she asked. Mercer answered from the sheet in his hand. "Removed from field schedule. Building access suspended. Equipment held pending review. Keep it that way." "Yes." "Ma'am." Walker slid another page across the desk. "Past settlement list. Redacted names. Dates. Claim amounts. Same officer code appearing more than once. Blake read the top line and stopped there. Ava read all the way to the bottom. Get legal on the city coverage question. She said, if conduct falls outside standard procedure, I want the answer in writing. Walker wrote it down. Blake looked toward the window and then back to the desk. So this morning becomes more than this morning. Ava closed the binder. It already is. By early afternoon, Hayes's name was off the next shift board. His building card no longer opened interior doors. The basement draft report stayed locked. The hallway footage stayed held. The property tag stayed attached to the tray record. And the file that had sat quiet for years was now moving desk to desk with new tabs on it. By 2:15, the office had cleared enough for one more meeting. Blake stood near the side credenza with a pad in his hand. Walker had the access log, the hallway stills, the voided intake line, and the settlement sheets stacked in order on the conference end of the desk. Mercer came in last. He was still in dress uniform. The coat was off now. Tyler stayed outside the door. Hayes was brought up through the service hall. No belt. No radio. No building card. He was in a plain department windbreaker over a wrinkled shirt. 2 internal review men walked him in and stopped just inside the office. They did not hold him. They did not need to. Mercer pointed to the open space in front of the desk. Stand there. Hayes did. Ava stayed seated. The same office door he had blocked that morning was now shut behind him. Walker put the first page on top of the stack. Access log, he said. Ava looked at Hayes. 6:15. Your building panel accepted my card. Walker set down the second page. Property record. Ava kept her eyes on Hayes. Same card. Tagged downstairs as recovered property. Walker set down the third page. Draft intake. Ava placed one finger on the first line. Restricted executive space. Refused to identify. Hayes looked at the papers. Then at Mercer. Then back at the desk. I made a call on a restricted floor. He said. That's what I did. Ava did not answer right away. Walker added the hallway stills beside the papers. One frame showed the green light on the panel. One showed the door open. One showed Hayes approaching before any call had been made. Ava tapped the still with the green light. You had a working credential in front of you. Then she tapped the intake line. You started here instead. Hayes shifted his feet once. She would not hand it over. The card had already done its job. Ava said, You skipped the first check. Mercer slid a short personnel sheet across the desk. Current status, he said. Ava read it once. Field schedule removed. Building access suspended. Equipment held pending review. Body camera upload preserved. Draft report locked. She set the sheet on top of the others. This is where the day stands now, she said. Hayes tried again. This got bigger because of who you are. Ava looked at him. It got bigger because the record is clean. Nobody in the room added to that. Walker reached for the settlement list next. He did not read every line. He only turned the page so Hayes could see the repeated officer code and the dates. City claims tied to your stops, Walker said. Hayes did not touch the paper. Mercer spoke from the side of the room. Internal review has requested the full file. Blake added the next point, without lifting his eyes from his notes. Union representation is under review. Hayes looked at him fast. Blake did not look back. Ava folded her hands on the desk. This morning was not treated as a hallway check. It was moved to detention before verification. That decision opened everything behind it. Hayes said nothing. Ava nodded once toward the stack. The city attorney is reviewing whether conduct outside standard procedure stays under city coverage. That answer will come back in writing. Now Hayes understood enough to stop talking. Walker closed the settlement binder and stepped back. Mercer gave the internal review men a glance, then looked back to Ava. Do you want him removed from the building now? He asked. Ava answered without changing her tone. Yes. Then she looked at Hayes again. You told me this office was restricted. Hayes kept his eyes on the front edge of the desk. Ava continued. This office is restricted. That part was true. You were wrong about who belonged here. She reached for the final paper in the stack. It was short. A routing notice. Temporary building. Exclusion. Pending formal review and access decision. She signed it and passed it to Mercer. Have facilities update the card list before end of day. She said, Yes, ma'am. Mercer handed the signed page to one of the review men. Hayes was turned toward the door. He stopped there when Ava spoke again. Mr. Hayes. He looked back. This morning you asked for ID after the card had already answered the first question. The office will keep that order in the record. He stood there for 1 second longer. Then the review men took him out through the same service hall he had not used in the morning. The door shut. Blake set his pad down. Walker gathered the papers into 2 stacks. Mercer remained standing. What do you want held for overnight? He asked. Ava answered from the desk. Everything tied to the hallway. The cell. The property tray. And the upload. Mercer wrote it down. No edits. Ava said, No edits. Mercer repeated. 3 weeks later. The marks on Ava's wrist had faded. The hallway footage was still under hold. The basement draft stayed locked in the system. The morning property entry still pointed back to the same card. Hayes's name no longer appeared on the active floor schedule at City Hall. His access did not open interior doors. The file from that morning had already been joined to older tabs and newer review notes. A personnel review date had already been set. The city coverage memo was back in writing. An internal case number had been assigned to the file. The signed exclusion notice was still active in the building system. The next city detail roster carried another name in his place. The second floor access list no longer carried his code. No city council had been attached to his side of it. No union council had been listed on the cover sheet. That morning did not stay inside standard procedure. The office door on the second floor kept opening every day. This time, nobody stopped Ava from walking through it. My view is simple. The whole story turned on one skipped check. Not a chase. Not a fight. Just one officer deciding not to verify what was already in front of him. That is what made the record so hard to defend later. If this story held up for you, drop your take in the comments. Share it with somebody who notices the small procedural steps people like to ignore. And subscribe to Black Tales Exposed for more stories told this way.